This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
Welcome, everybody, back for the fall for the 23rd year of the Stanford Seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Scott Clemmer. I'll be your host this fall. And I'm extremely excited to announce that our speaker today is Scott Snibbe. I asked Scott this summer if he could come speak in the fall, and I asked him in particular, I said, could you come the first week because I think you'd be a really great kickoff speaker. And I'd like to tell you why. I met Scott in the late 90s when he was working on new kinds of haptic user interfaces. And Scott has long been one of my role models in terms of somebody who's been able to have a creative research thread and product thread for his whole life. And each decade he does something new and interesting. So when I met him, he was working on computer animated films and haptic user interfaces at a secret think tank on Page Mill Road called Interval Research. After that, he moved on and started his own studio producing artistic installations that have been shown worldwide in a number of galleries. And in the years since, he's moved on to a number of different platforms. Not only has he worked with folks like Bjork for her latest Biophilia album, but when the iPhone and iPad came out, he published an interesting article called Why Art Wants to Be 99 Cents. And so he's been thinking about new platforms for interactive media for a long time. And Scott's put together some of his thinking on this issue that he's going to share with us today.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here, and you guys are so lucky to have Terry and Scott and Jeff as people to work with. They're really unique and outstanding in their field as people who combine a complete view of humanity, technology, and creativity all at once. There's very few people I know like you guys, so it's always an honor to get to come here and speak in this setting. So to explain a little bit who I am, if there was a big company I could work in to do what I do, I kind of wish I could, but there still isn't. So I ended up starting a couple of companies on my own. One's called Snibbe Interactive, that produces interactive gestural experiences, and the other is called Snibbe Studio, that makes interactive apps, primarily music apps. And it's interesting, my whole life, like Scott mentioned, I've kind of struggled in my life trying to figure out how to express new ideas in culture that are somewhere between art and technology and just humanity, communication. And I think I've come, especially in the last few years, to believe that, at least in today's culture in the West, maybe starting a company is potentially like the most creative act you can do. It seems like the idea of what a product is has radically changed, especially in the last few years, where all of a sudden things that would have been called works of art, installation, crazy, etc., are now like viable business models, especially around here. So it's a very, very exciting time, and for those of you who are just kind of graduating into it, I think it's especially nice because you can avoid, I think, a lot of pain of the time before when there wasn't such an easy avenue for the expression of strange ideas. So I'd like to begin just talking a little bit about our perception. I think often we forget, some of us may have never even thought about it, that none of us actually perceive reality, but we rather reconstruct a model of reality in our brains from 5 time-varying sense streams, right? So our current consensual view of reality, it's only one of an infinite array of those possible to perceive with this sensory apparatus that we have. And I think we often also forget that we do have a sixth sense, that the brain isn't just an integrator, but it's also a sixth sense generator of sense stimuli. And we have access to alternate realities when we dream, when we hallucinate, when we imagine, and when we perceive works of art. So most of my career has been an interest in finding time-based I guess you'd call them like super stimuli that produce alternate perceptual realities in our brains. I got really excited about computers, as soon as I saw them, and realized it was a way to create a billion other forms of reality in addition to the one that we ordinarily see, with our eyes and touch with our fingertips. So I like to show a few examples. Something really troubling has happened in culture in the last 10 years is that, I bet you know the reference, Scott, but the window of references in scientific publications and also in the news and so on has now shrunk to 10 years, where there used to be like a longer tail. Do you know about this? Or? Yeah. And so when I give a talk, I like to talk of particular influences I think that are of benefit to anybody interested in human-computer interaction, and they mostly come from the arts. Does anybody know what this image is by any chance? Okay, that's good. Then my time is not wasted here. So this is a work of art called a Cornell box. This one was made in 1940. What's interesting is that it's about the size of an iPad, and it's interactive. It's a little box that's filled with stuff. I particularly like this one because it has a musical paper in the background. It has sand. It has a pearl. And you actually play around with it. But it's not useful in any ordinary sense. The purpose is just to give you an alternate interactive reality that you dive into. Joseph Cornell was a surrealist. He was the only kind of accepted member of the surrealist movement from the United States. And I was lucky because my parents were artists, and they introduced me to works like this when I was quite young. And I really wanted to make stuff like that. We had a workshop when I was growing up, and I would make things like this out of plastic, where you'd put sand and other things inside of it. But interactivity isn't merely with computers. It's not just digital interactivity. There's ways of making kind of mechanical forms of interactivity. By the way, have any of you read Count Zero, the William Gibson novel? That's oh yeah, looks like yes. There's an interesting footnote about Cornell boxes, because in that book is about the kind of unleashing of artificial intelligence. It's a future where artificial intelligences are throttled, and this one finds a way of breaking out, and then it lives on this space station surrounding the Earth. And the whole plot of the novel hinges around trying to figure out where these counterfeit Cornell boxes are coming from. Somehow they're very valuable. Even today, they're very valuable. So they're finding counterfeit Cornell boxes for sale in galleries. And the whole novel is tracking down where they're coming from. And it turns out that that's what this artificial intelligence is making. It has this big space with tons of just garbage spinning around in a space station. And given like massively more intelligence than human beings have, what this artificial intelligence has chose to do is to make Cornell boxes all day long. So it's possible that's the highest achievement of intelligence, is to sit around making these kind of things. Of course, there's other ways of accessing alternate realities. I particularly like these two because they are, touch screens. One is through the looking glass, right? That a mirror is a touch screen. And I think maybe it's the first one we discover. I have a young daughter now, and I notice, that incredible fascination with mirrors. And I think, through literature, but particularly in through the looking glass, there's a fascination of what's behind that screen. There's also a film on next to that image is a still from a film called Orpheus by Jean Cocteau. Again, I was lucky because my parents were so weird. So my dad took me to see this movie when I was like 16. And if you like The Matrix, you'll really love this movie, because maybe all of the ideas in The Matrix actually come from this movie. But they were done in this very practical, scrappy way, because they didn't have digital special effects. In fact, they didn't even use optical special effects. Everything in the movie is done practically through sort of clever tricks of materials. So plunging through a mirror, as in this scene, was done by filling a pool with mercury and then filming it sideways and having someone wear gloves. You can see carefully, if you look carefully, the person's wearing gloves, and dipping into that mirror. So for me, this was the ultimate looking glass. When I was 10 years old, I was introduced to an Apple II computer. And the neat thing about computers in those days is you turned them on, and all you had was a flashing cursor and a manual of how to write basic programming. So now we have this maker culture reemerging, but back in the day with these computers, there was nothing to do except write code. And what struck me about the computer screen, even then when I was like 10 years old, was that it's not like a typewriter. It's more like a movie screen. And that on the screen of a computer, you have an infinitely varying plane of light, time-varying light and color, right? So anything's possible on the computer screen. And it's really, really important to remember that now, because we've pushed so many metaphors, some of them like very, very boring metaphors, like the desktop metaphor, onto something that has infinite potential. And I think if there's one kind of lesson I'd love to be able to convey to people that was obvious to those of us when we had computers without an interface, is that you can make anything you want on that screen. It's like a movie screen. And this was one of the programs that I really dug. Oh, that's strange. Huh. Oh, there you go. This was one of the programs that was one of my favorite programs when I was a kid, called Pinball Construction Set. Let's see if it plays. Oh, weird. Something strange with it's showing it here. Oh, something got corrupted, I think. Very, very weird. I might have to just tell you about it then. It's not it. Well, let me just tell you about it then. I think it's the new OS or something. So, yeah. Okay, cool. So let me just tell you about this program because it's amazing. It came out in 1983, and it's a program where you have this pinball game, but it starts up, and the pinball machine is empty. And on the right is a palette of pinball stuff, like bumpers and flippers, and you can drag any of them into the program that you like and make any kind of pinball machine you want. So the first thing I did was put 100 flippers in, and see what's the game like. But what that introduced me to was the idea of a meta program, that you could make a kind of computer program or game that is a superset of all possibilities within a creative system, and there aren't as many things like that today. But it really inspired me to maybe want to make stuff like that. Okay, so now let's see. I hope that other movie actually plays where it's supposed to play. So this is another program that came out the year after, in 1984, called Music Construction Set. Let's see if that plays. Okay. Oh, a lot of problems. Maybe it's the HDMI thing or something. I don't know. Let's try again. Program. It was sold as a game, and it was a bestseller. Made huge amounts of money. And as soon as I got this program, I wanted to go fill it with something. So I went to the music store and I bought sheet music for like New Order and the Beatles and the Clash and other kind of music I liked. And I started to just understand music by playing with it. And what I liked about this is that it kind of tricks you into learning something, like somehow, because I was taking music lessons and I'd never practice, I'd never do my homework. But then this, because it was just so fun and it wasn't described as education or lessons, I actually learned way more about music through that process. And of course, this is somebody all of us I think are inspired by one way or another, either for or against Steve Jobs. So one thing I want to discuss here is actually a little bit of criticism, but mostly praise. So when the Mac first came out, I think even though I was like 14 or something, I was actually one of the few people that was a little bit disappointed with it, because of that reason of the computer screen's potential to be anything. I was a little disappointed that now the computer screen got collapsed to be a desk, like with a trash and folders. Like I thought, what's the one thing I've never taken a picture of in my house, in my life, is my desk. It's like the most boring thing in my life. I mean, I get things done there, but there's nothing really that exciting or inspiring about it. So I was a little bit disappointed and kind of dreaming more about cinematic interfaces, which now, of course, we see with the iPad. Like, Apple has gone to cinematic interfaces in a way none of us could have imagined, using a language of wipes, dissolves, fades, and so on. But at the time, I was a little bit disappointed. Now, the thing, though, the bigger thing I wanted to talk about Steve Jobs, though, was about influence. You know, someone asked him, I bet a lot of you know this quote, but somebody asked him, why have you been so much more creative and innovative than Bill Gates? And he said, well, it's pretty simple, and it's not anything to do with me intrinsically or my mind or my brain. It's just that I took big swaths of my time and I did strange things with them. I took typography classes, I went to India, I meditated, I lived in an ashram for a while, and I took acid. I think he's the only CEO who's ever advocated taking acid as the key to innovation. But I think he's right, not necessarily about taking acid, but that you need to fill up your mind somehow with a lot of other stuff outside of your field. And I think even in science, I've read that most innovations come from people outside of the field. You know, like with DNA, it came from like X-ray crystallography and physics. So that's what I'd like to encourage people, and that's why there's sort of a long preamble to this talk before I actually show any of the stuff I've made, because I think it's really important to show where it all comes from. It's not just some cool idea I had. It's actually mostly stuff that I learned from being, you know, curious. So this is one of the biggest things that influenced me, was abstract film. This is a film by Oskar Fischinger, who pioneered abstract animation. And you might say, like, what use is abstract animation? Well, here's some of it, so you know what it is. This is from a film that he made in 1931 called Study Number 8. And it's a way of visualizing music with motion. But what you see here is that there's a mind behind this, and there's a system that you can intuitively understand, but also one that doesn't directly Mickey Mouse music. There's a term, like, it's become so standardized that the term Mickey Mousing is actually a verb. That means to just mimic in a mechanical way the sound or something else in your life. And that's exactly what you want to avoid in making some kind of visualization of music. It's exactly the aspects of music that you could mechanically visualize that are the ones that aren't interesting, right? So somehow what Oskar Fischinger has done in these films is kind of visualize the way a human mind interprets music, right? Because music is one of the several things that doesn't exist out in the world. It only exists within our minds, and it's reconstructed because of the peculiarities of how our brain works. The other thing is that these films are so visually sophisticated and have such a sophisticated structure that I think even for thinking about like the layout of icons or images on a page, it's what it is it's a mature time-based medium. And human-computer interface still may not even be the mature time-based medium. You know, it might be so maybe in 20 years or so. Like, we're still building that language. But people close to 100 years ago actually matured another time-based medium, a film. And I think that's an amazing place to look for inspiration. This is another example by Len Lai, a filmmaker that inspired me greatly. And he pioneered making films without a camera. It was quite an innovation. People didn't really think about it for the most part. They always thought you make a film by taking one picture over another. And he thought, well, I can make a film just by scratching, drawing, etc. on film. So this is from my favorite film by him called Free Radicals. And it's made by scratching black leader. And especially for those of us who study computer graphics, you know, we immediately say, oh, did he use a computer to do that? Like, if something moves in 3D, you must have a, linear algebra behind it. But in this case, he actually just scratched over and over with a kind of crude, like an awl, and created this incredible sense of movement. And what I like about this type of movement is that, to me, it looks like somebody thinking. Like Oskar Fischinger's work looks like works that's composed, like a music that somebody wrote. But this looks like music that somebody improvised, like jazz. So in a way, this is kind of like the jazz of animation. This is from 1958. So there were a number of people tried to create instruments for performing an abstraction in real time. This is one called the lumograph, which is a sheet that you press into. This is one by Marcel Duchamp, who is the pioneer of conceptual art, where he made these devices called rotoreliefs, where you put these discs on a spinning turntable, and they have perceptual illusions, color. And I like to mention some of these people because very few people know that a number of these like time-based artists and filmmakers were also entrepreneurs. So Marcel Duchamp, believe it or not, rented a spot in this exhibition hall for an event called the Concours Le Pain in Paris. It was an annual trade show for inventors. And he was actually right next to the first food processor and the first trash compactor. And he was exhibiting this, which is kind of like the first app, right? That's like this spinning device is like the iPhone. And then these things were little apps that you could put on top of them. Unfortunately, he didn't sell any. Actually, it was completely unsuccessful. And most of them were destroyed. But then he became quite famous later. And he reproduced these and started selling them in the 60s again. You can see why it was popular in the 60s. This also is something I'm sure almost none of you know about. There's a guy named Thomas Wilfred who built a device called the Clavilux before television. This was before television was invented or distributed. These were available for sale. He only made 18, and I think he only sold like 3. But they were these abstract light and color performance devices with a little control panel, totally interactive. It's kind of like the first, Xbox or something like that. And they're really quite moving if you ever see them. This is a still from the image. Did anybody see The Tree of Life, a film by Terrence Malick? Some people. So there are these scenes in the movie that have abstract movement and color in them. I think the fairest interpretation is that those scenes represent God, basically. And I think you can make a good point that this device did a better job portraying God than like Morgan Freeman or something like that. It's really the right medium. So I started experimenting like in the 80s and the 90s with mashing up all this stuff. We didn't have that word mashup back then, but mashing up some of these stuff that I was really passionate about with digital computers. So this was really the first kind of polished thing I ever made in this vein called Motion Phone. And it was an abstract animation communication system. So you'd have a screen. In this case, it was an SGI computer, and you could move, and your movements would turn into animation. And then it's also possible to connect to another person. I'm actually going to turn the sound off here. So 2 people at once could communicate and create together with essentially an alternate form of communication. So there you see both of us. This is like $80,000 worth of equipment in 1996 or something. But what interested me is that everybody sort of has this inside of them. Like we all have this ability to just move and create extremely complicated alternate visual forms of communication if you just give somebody the right tool. And of course, it was real time. That's what I was really excited about, is not making something composed, but making something that you're instantly creating over and over again, and that it doesn't even matter if you saved it. It's more the process of doing it that's interesting. And of course, there came a time to distribute these programs. I'm not going to demonstrate this one because it's quite similar, but it's available in the App Store now called Motion Phone. And you can actually do this now with other people for $1.99 or whatever we sell it for. So I started experimenting a lot with these screen-based interactive systems, particularly influenced by nature. These were the 3 programs called Bubble Harp, Gravelex, and Antigraph. Especially after I started showing in galleries, I tried to really refine what I was doing so that it didn't have any interface at all. You notice in Motion Phone I still had buttons and sliders and so on. And that kind of disappointed me because it got in the way of people interacting because they had to start thinking kind of more rationally and symbolically rather than intuitively. So I started making these programs that there was nothing there, that the interface is just touch. Of course, touch through a mouse, because that's what we had in the 90s. And I struggled with how to distribute and exhibit this kind of work on screens. Was an obvious way, but it's quite clunky because then you'd have this little mouse coming out and a button to erase. Then as pen tablet computers started emerging, I would show that, but then you're always nervous you're going to lose that expensive pen or someone's going to steal it. And then we had this idea when I was working at Interval Research with a guy named Golan Levin. We thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we took these kind of cool abstract experiences and make a device like this big, and you could touch on the back. So put the touch screen on the back so your finger is never in the way, and you could just like trip out all day long and just enjoy these experiences, because experiences actually have a very positive effect mentally on you. You get really, really absorbed, almost like in a meditative state. Because it's hard to really convince anybody to meditate, even though it would be really good for you, actually. But to make something cool that brings people into like a more relaxed, open, creative state. So in LA, everybody has an idea for a screenplay, no matter what their job is. In this area, everybody has an idea for business. I'm sure everybody here has one. So this was our idea for business, and we started pitching it, and nobody ended up funding it. Now, admittedly, we didn't have the idea that it should also be a phone, an address book, etc. That would have been a really good idea. Anyway. My time will come. All right. So then this was the way people started showing this kind of, it started getting labeled digital art, and I was in a lot of art shows, and I'd show stuff like this, but I never really had the heart. These are just laptops that you take apart and put on a nice mount. But I never really had the heart to sell them because I knew they were going to break, right? Everything, every laptop breaks within 5 years. So I was just waiting for some way to distribute this kind of work. And then, of course, it arrived. We found it when the iPad and the iPhone came out. So I'll show you a couple of these. I was really surprised that they were so popular. This is an app called Gravelux, and it's a way of drawing with stars. So you just kind of move with your fingertips, and it's like you're in control of the universe. It's quite fun on a really long time scale. And this got like 600,000 downloads or something, really large amounts of downloads, and it was very encouraging because like I said, I was always trying to convince people to distribute this kind of work. And now, once the app stores came about, then you don't have to convince anybody that your idea is good, or what category it fits into, or if there's a market, you can just release it, and if people like it, they don't have to label it or worry about it being art or entertainment or anything else. This is another app. Let me turn up the volume. Okay. This is an app called Bubble Harp. So this is a visual musical instrument. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Here we go. So with this app, I'll turn it up a little bit. It's a way of creating a kind of animated painting and a melody at the same time. So as you draw on the screen, you create these points that follow your fingertips, and then this line between the points gets played as if it's a harp string. So again, it's hard to explain what this is. It's a combination of like animation, interactivity, music. If you really dig in, you can go and change the scales. So you can see how your melody sounds in a chromatic scale rather than a pentatonic. So secretly, this is actually educational, and people learn a lot about scales because you can just understand intuitively like what a blues scale sounds like, or this Hungarian scale that sounds very exotic to Western ears. But it's very satisfying to be able to instantly create a song, right? So all these were based on natural phenomena. This is the most realistic one. This was an app called Antigraph, where you draw with ants. Actually, let's see here. So we can You can try to draw with this, which is actually sort of fun. But what you see is like just as if they were real ants, they start to lose their trail. So it's a lot of what I do actually is a little bit frustrating because this idea of impermanence has always been quite heavy in my mind. So I like to make things that are sort of destroying themselves as they go, so you kind of have to keep engaged. But again, this is secretly educational. I feel like I would never put anything in the educational category because the word education sadly almost means boring, in our culture today for the most part. But I've given a friend of mine who works at Nature Publications said that his son was using this program and asked him, what exactly am I drawing? Like, there are these ants, but then they stay on the trail. And then his dad said, oh, well, ants lay down pheromone, and it's an invisible chemical, and that's what you're doing. You're painting at the same time ants and pheromone. So, in terms of education, especially with, younger people, to lead people to start asking questions through doing something extremely fun and satisfying is probably a more powerful way to teach than a harshly structured kind of curriculum. More on that later. So I actually, though, there was a big time between all that screen-based work, which was basically my passion, but I never had any understanding of how to distribute it. I mean, so much so that I used to call them useless programs. It was kind of a defensive posture. I think our Andy Van Dam, who was a great mentor, would look at this stuff sometimes and he'd say, like, 2D is a solved problem, because we did 3D computer graphics. And I said, no, there's actually a lot to do in 2 dimensions, because with 3D computer graphics, you're kind of stuck in the Renaissance with perspective, but there's so many other forms of expression in 2 dimension to even now still to explore with the computer. So between that time with the iPad and kind of giving up on screen-based work, I started making these installations, gestural installations. This was one called Boundary Functions. It's the first one I made. I think it's one of the very first gestural computer vision. I guess they call them computer vision graphic systems. And it's a floor that you walk on, and it draws lines between people. And the lines form... Since 1991, I've been creating it. I actually bet a lot of people know what these diagrams are called, right? Like, in this audience, how many people know what this diagram is called? A lot, yeah. So these are called Voronoi diagrams. And the diagrams have an enormous amount of meaning when you look at them in the physical world. The structure of bubbles is forms in these diagrams. The gravitational influence of stars. Dogs even pee in these patterns, believe it or not. And when people are moving through space, your personal space is described as a Voronoi diagram, the space that's closer to you than to anybody else. But what I wanted to show is that you actually don't have any when you're alone, see? So when you walk onto this floor alone, nothing happens. So it's a pretty radical interactive experience because you can't experience it alone. There has to be more people there. And the more people enter, the better it is. And that's always been my point of view on body interactivity or gestural interactivity. Is there another word for this field? I don't know what we still don't have quite a word for it. Is that I felt that if more than one person can fit into an experience, then it should meaningfully respond to them and ideally get better, kind of like the way normal life does, So that's the boundary functions. The other thing I found about this is that it was actually a social psychological experiment, and it showed the differences between cultures and how we think about personal space. So I first showed this in Austria and Germany. And I was really disappointed because people just kind of grouped on the edges and wouldn't, for the most part, move onto the stage. So I actually thought I'd failed. It was really my first work of interactive art like this. And I thought, and you give up a lot of control when you make anything interactive. And so I thought, wow, I've really failed. I thought people were going to interact. And during the opening they did because it was so crowded, but for the most part people were kind of shy. Then I showed the same piece in Japan, and people behaved completely differently. In Japan, strangers would come up to each other, would touch each other, so they were doing exactly what I hoped for. And so what I realized is that different cultures have different points of view about personal space. And I started looking it up, and there's a field called proxemics, it turns out, that studies this formally. And the whole field can be summarized actually as a joke, where they say if you put an Italian and a Swede in a room together, the Italian will start chasing the Swede around the room. You know, have you ever talked to like a Spanish person, Italian person?
Are ones that can be found in much of my work.
Anyway, you probably could do real science experiments with this if you wanted to. So I also began working on these interactive screens, again, mostly just with, you know, homegrown code. This was before like open frameworks and Connect and things like that. So this was, again, one of the first pieces I made called Deep Walls. And it's a wall that absorbs everything that happens in front of it and plays it back. Now there's a really, really important kind of HCI lesson here, and it seems super obvious once you learn about it. But if you were kind of given the assignment to make a personal movie generating application, most of us would take a kind of photo booth approach to it, where you give someone press a button, then there's a countdown, 3, 2, 1, then you have 30 seconds to make your movie, and then you watch it. So what's wrong with that? From my point of view, what's wrong with that is it makes the computer in control of person. And what you really want is a person in control of the computer. So in this case, it's really, really simple. As soon as the first person enters, the system starts recording, and as soon as the last person exits, it stops recording, and then that movie gets pasted into one of 16 rectangles. So relatively simple, and certainly very simple to implement, you know, if you're ever making something like this, but a very important lesson about like human-centered design. The other thing is about using a silhouette. Well, that's the third thing, is about behavior. I started to learn that these experiences can actually change people's behavior, because if I asked everyone in this room to come and do a break dance in front of everybody here, I don't think I'd have any takers. But if we turned on this piece, almost all of you would want to do it. So you can actually change people's behavior and make them kind of more outgoing, more extroverted by rewarding that somehow with the interactivity, especially this physical gestural interactivity. Then the last thing is, So the last thing is about shadows themselves. I found the shadow a really powerful interface because there's all these privacy concerns and also, you know, vanity concerns about recording somebody's image. So the shadow solves that very elegantly, because you can recognize your silhouette and other people's and your friends' silhouettes instantly, and yet to everybody else you're anonymous. So it's a very, in an age that we have more and more intrusions on our privacy. Privacy may not even be a word in 10 years, much like computer, actually. I think both those words won't exist anymore. But this actually preserves your privacy and yet lets you have an individualized experience. And I think there's other solutions like that in technology. Like, I don't think every answer has to be reveal more private information about yourself. This is a piece where I started to try taking interactivity into storytelling. There's this movie called Chien Andalou that begins like with an eyeball getting sliced. Did any of you guys ever see that? It was the first surrealist film by Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel. And so I started playing with this medium a little bit more. Again, this is still a while ago, like 2006. But the idea was to take a vignette from that movie and make it interactive. So what's it like to make an interactive scene from a movie? So here your body interacts with this just in two simple ways. One is by pushing away the piano, which makes this guy sort of strain more and pulling it. And the other is if you touch the guy himself. So if you touch him for long enough, something happens. So you see he starts to dissolve into ants. So I use those same ants. I think any of you who are programmers, you start to build up your little collection of tricks, right? And somehow people really, I was worried that, you know, this is more of a like metaphorical piece, but everybody understood it. Somehow this is like an archetypal image of a man pulling a piano. Everybody understands it to kind of represent just, you know, the nature of human existence. Right, very easy to interpret. And then I want to show one. I did do a lot of work like with haptics and other kind of physical interfaces, and I want to show one example. I know. I met Scott. Scott and I used to talk about that stuff. And this is again a kind of extreme example of seemingly useless device. It's a little console that you blow into, and then it takes your breath and it amplifies it into this array of fans. So it turns like breath into wind, basically, and takes something really personal and makes it public. I mean, the thing I was getting after was that we always, when we say breath, we almost always say my breath. It's my breath. But it's probably the last thing in the world that's yours. Like it or not, we've all breathed in each other already in the last half hour, and I've breathed you out. Like we have become part of each other over the course of the last half an hour. So I wanted to make a work of art that sort of pushed at that idea that your breath really isn't yours. It's actually this extremely public transaction. And when you make big physical experiences like this, you also get in some ways a much nicer experience because you can see through it, you can walk around it, you can sort of choose how close or how far or how tight you engage. And it's probably better suited to people's kind of proprioception than just a screen on a wall. But it's very difficult and expensive making this kind of stuff. It's sort of crazy project and never do again. But I mean, that's what, if you want to say what's art, it's making something useless. Like it's the only purpose of making objects and experiences like a lot of the ones I've showed you so far is to convey an idea, right? It's sort of like writing a book, but you make it physical. A lot of people always ask, what is art, right? And so it's a little dangerous to go into this territory, but that would be the definition I would advocate, is where you're creating an object or an experience that's main purpose is to communicate an idea rather than a utilitarian purpose. So about 7 years ago, I started a company, and or I guess it was only 5 years ago, and we started taking a lot of these experiences and turning them into things that we sell. A lot of it came by demand because I had museums interested in showing this kind of work. This is one of the ones that I really liked called Looking for Life. There's this experiment where they ran electricity through this vat of chemicals resembling the early oceans. And when you do, you get these amino acids spontaneously formed. I think the people who did the experiment secretly hoped they'd start getting, eventually little creatures sort of crawling out of this vat. But you only get the precursors to life. So there's still this kind of mystery of how self-replicating life emerged. And we explore that a little bit in this piece. People get struck by lightning, cell walls form around them, protocells come up, and then there's this kind of magical, mystical moment where we don't quite know how and when cells became self-replicating. Oh, it's called Looking for Life?
Director James Cameron's revolutionary film.
Let me, I'm going to mute this, so there we go. This is sort of taking it to the next level. We worked with James Cameron. This is often the only video I show now to explain what we do because it's high production values. But we did a bunch of interactive experiences through Snibbe Interactive with James Cameron to try to bring some of those experiences to life through interactive experiences. I was a little scared, because James Cameron has a kind of rough reputation. But actually, he was amazed because we took stuff that wasn't interactive and made it work with today's technologies. So these kind of shadow walls, this is one where you relive a scene from the movie where the wood sprites come, and if you're moving slowly, they'll come and land directly on you. So this actually shows a little bit more of how you can manipulate people's behavior because it encourages going slow. So actually people would slow down and be gentle. This is an experience, more of a tablet experience, where you can create a scene from Avatar. So James Cameron actually did this virtual cinematography, making his own scenes through digital three-dimensional environments. This lets people do that themselves and compare. And then touch tables, which are now a kind of commodity. There's still a lot of subtlety, I think, to doing these right. And again, the emphasis me and my company have is on social interaction. How can you encourage social interaction with touch technologies? And a big part of it is making it big enough and making interfaces that are multi-touch, multi-person, so you can share information, move it back and forth. And we love using these tiles too that instantly pop up a bunch of information and then instantly take it away. And then finally, this is like the future of interaction, even beyond Connect, are these systems. I think you guys have some really advanced ones, like with Vicon. This is a slightly lower end system, but where you walk in this space, and then you can become one of the characters from Avatar. And you know, and you're actually directed by James Cameron in this case, which is kind of funny because then we had to direct James Cameron, direct the director, to make this exhibit. I think you'll see a lot more of this in the future because, I mean, people talk about goggles and immersive reality, but I love this experiences where nothing's on you. It's completely unencumbered, and you just walk into a space and you're magically transported somewhere else. And, you know, this is the kind of direction we're taking this kind of work towards, you know, bigger, spectacular experiences. I think as movie theaters die, which they will over the next few years, you might start seeing stuff like this popping up in them, which kind of excites me because, you know, my career sort of hit a wall because you want to tell stories with this medium, but there's no, like, theater to go and experience it yet. So now to take a little alternate tour. This is some work we did back in the day. This we want to hear. So again, this was kind of work that didn't really have a distribution medium. This was in the 90s when I was working at Interval Research, and we were so excited by Pro Tools, which is a new way of making music, like without instruments, just digital music, video games, which had this new form of like incredible controller, and then DJ culture, which was again a way of, you know, non-musicians creating new forms of music. So we mashed all that up and started creating these kind of interfaces where you could create music again as a total amateur. You just play something that's like a game, and yet the output is a song or a loop. So here we're particularly inspired by, you know, electronica and that kind of music. So again, how do you distribute this? We kind of had to wait, you know, about 15 years or so until the iPad came out. And now, you know, this is available. It's called Oscilloscope. It's available in the App Store. I'm not going to demo it for lack of time. But, you know, the same experience sort of packaged and now distributable. You know, you don't have to convince like a game distributor to take it on. So something interesting, because of all this App Store work that I started putting out there, it got the interest of someone who I was a big fan of, Bjork. I love this picture because she's sort of looking at me like I'm like the crazy one here. And she has that's a beautiful dress she has. It's a spliced evening gown and a mini dress, like just sewn together. And it turned out that she had a project that she had started, and she realized really, really early on that the album is dead, and she wanted to release her new work of music, feature-length work of music, as something else and something interactive. And the project's called Biophilia. And her first 6 albums that Bjork produced were more about her experiences in her life, emotional experiences, the kind of stories, you know, you hear a lot of people singing about. So for her 7th album, she decided she wanted to do something totally different. And so the subject matter she took outside of her own life was everything else in the whole universe. So every single song has something to do with natural phenomenon, something to do with music and musicology, and something to do with interactivity. And she was looking for different ways to express this. At first, she was thinking about a touring exhibition, then an IMAX movie that Michel Gondry would direct. Luckily, he got busy in Green Hornet reshoots, and so this is what we made instead, which was an app. So this is Biophilia. It begins in this kind of galaxy. That's the album cover. Let me show you what it looks like when you first launch it.
Welcome to Biophilia, the love for nature in all her manifestations.
Hopefully some of you recognize David Attenborough's voice.
From the tiniest organism to the greatest red giant floating in the farthest realm of the universe. With Biophilia comes a restless curiosity, an urge to investigate and discover the elusive places where we meet nature, where she plays on our senses with colours and forms, perfumes and smells, the taste and touch of salty wind on the tongue. But much of nature is hidden from us, that we can neither see nor touch, like the one phenomenon that can be said to move us more than any other in our daily lives: sound. Sound, harnessed by human beings, delivered with generosity and emotion, is what we call music.
So I like to go up to that spot because I love that definition that music is sound plus generosity. And I think it's a good idea for any of us to think of our job as something plus generosity. It really kind of helps you and keeps you in a relatively positive mood. So the way this album works is that this galaxy has a number of constellations, 10, and each of them is one of the songs. So Crystalline was the first app that was released, the first single. Now, there are a number of common elements to every song, and then there's a unique element. So some of the common elements are ways of looking at the music itself. So here you see a traditional musical score, albeit a really beautiful one. So this is kind of like a karaoke. It's missing the vocal track, so you can sing along with it if you like. Again, everything here is totally interactive. None of this is a movie, so you can, scroll backwards and forwards and find and understand the music. And again, this is really, I think, for anyone who's done any music at all, it's almost like shivers you get when you see music that you really love for the first time in a notational form, and you realize, oh, that's the same way Bach made music or Beethoven made music. You can also turn off the music track and get a metronome, and then you could put this on your music stand and you could play the music with a piano, a flute, and so on. And if you go on YouTube, people are actually doing this. They're making their own versions of Bjork's songs. Now, Bjork's classically trained, but actually she was relatively impatient and frustrated with the way they teach Western music, which, like a lot of topics, the way they're taught, it often deadens them. So we did another form of visualization. So we created these abstract animated scores. So here, actually, you can see the musical structure much better than in Western music, right? And we separate the different instruments with color. The vocal track is blue, and again, you can zoom backwards and forwards. Now, and to bring home the fact that this is actually useful, it's not just a beautiful visualization. Bjork and the other artists actually use this visualization on stage as a teleprompter to guide them through the music as they're performing, in preference to any other way. Okay, so now the main event in each app is some kind of unique experience. Can everyone still hear me okay as I'm doing this? Okay, great. So with Crystalline, what you can do is twist and catch crystals or scrape crystals off the side of this these tunnels. And then as you get to the end of a tunnel, you can choose another one. And what happens is you're choosing a different part of the song to go into. Okay, thanks. So the natural aspect to this is obviously crystals. The musical aspect is about musical structure. You can actually restructure this song in 10,000 different ways. And then interactively, it's the most like a game of any of the experiences in here. And again, you might ask why does it look like this and not another way? Part of it is a kind of nostalgia for games like Tempest and stuff in the 80s. But the idea actually came from Bjork, because she said when she listens to music, she actually sees images like this in her head. Like she has a kind of mild synesthesia where she sees a tunnel where the number of sides relate to the kind of tempo or the beat structure, and then that changes as it goes through different parts of the song. Here we go. Okay, so let's take another one. Virus is something completely different. So this app is like more like a music video, but an interactive music video. So the song plays, and everything here is interactive. You can grab cells and move them around by dragging them. And then viruses are coming in as this song starts to play. So the viruses are attacking the central cell, and the song itself is a kind of, instead of a femme fatale, it's like a virus fatale song. It's a story of viruses loving a cell so much that they need to kill it. you see the cells sing along with the chorus on the outside. So this is, it feels like a game, and you can actually take the viruses and fling them away and start to protect the central cell. But if you do, you get stuck 2 verses in and you go into an instrumental holding pattern. So it's a game that you actually have to lose in order to win. You have to let the cell get killed, infected, and then killed in order to hear the whole song. It's also a way to stretch out a song too, because you can stretch out the parts that you like and turn a 5-minute song into a 15-minute song. So there are a lot of different ways of making interactive music, you know, and we were lucky because we got to explore it in the 90s at Interval, and now there's this whole sort of vocabulary to draw on in apps like this. So here's one that's, again, also completely different. This is Thunderbolt, and in this app, you can kind of make little sparks if you touch. If you drag, you can draw with lightning. And if you put your two fingers down, you create arpeggios. So if your fingers are close, you create 1 note, then 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes. So an arpeggio is just a sequence of notes for any of you that don't know that. And you can increase the tempo by moving up, and decrease it by moving down. And then you can also make non-sequential arpeggios by putting 3, 4, 5 fingers down. So that app is more like an instrument, but again, it's a very idiosyncratic kind of personal instrument. And I think that's what's really exciting about the tablet, is completely reinventing music as a new audiovisual medium. It's a moment that's almost like the birth of opera or the birth of cinema that will greatly transform music. I'll show you one last one. You can't go through them all, but this is an app. This one was written by Max Weisel, who's a great young programmer. And in this app, you can change notes. So it's a kind of sequencer, like a harp sequencer. You move these pearls to determine which note plays. And then the phase of the moon here determines how much spinal fluid is coming up from the Earth. Okay, it's a really interesting metaphor about the connection of like our body to the planets, which there really is, right? And then if you make the moon brighter and brighter, you play more and more notes. Oh, that almost sounded like the sound of silence or something. There you go. There you go. Or you can load Bjork's song and play that too. Okay. So you can dive into that yourselves if you have an iPhone or an iPad sometime. So we were talking a little bit about the album and the death of the album. Now, actually, I bet not that many people in the audience ever even bought an LP and brought it home. How many people come from the age of the LP, have brought an LP home? Okay, yeah, it's like a minority in this group. So let me tell you about that experience. You'd buy this thing, you wouldn't know what it sounds like. You just buy this 12 by 12 inch object, mostly based on the way it looked. And you bring it home, you'd open it up, and you'd go to your turntable and put it down. And for some reason, often you'd be on the floor, like it was almost like a holy moment when you got your album, and you'd be stuck there, and you'd be listening to the album while you decipher the artwork and read the liner notes and the lyrics. So what I call this is the falling in love period with music. This is the time when you're completely absorbed, all your senses, with music. And we've lost that now in the age of the MP3. Now I'd say we have more like a casual relationship with music, kind of like hook up with music here and there. But we've missed that falling in love stage. And it's not inevitable, actually, that all media goes towards like shorter and shorter forms and more distracted. I think with the iPad, we're seeing this blossoming again of long-term deep engagement. And it's possible with many other media. So to kind of bring that, what, I might skip, this is such an interesting thing, but we're running a little bit. Well, I don't know, how long do we have? Till 2? Okay, that's worth talking then. So probably a lot of you guys know who this is, John McCarthy. There's this great, I bet you guys read this. There was this article called A Fight to Win the Future, Computers versus Humans by John Markoff last year in the New York Times. And it was talking about these two fundamentally different views of technology. So John McCarthy coined the term AI. Terry knows him, knew him. And to put it simply and bluntly, at least in terms of like the way this essay was written, is that there was an idea that computers would replace human intelligence in some form or another. And there was another point of view that was championed by someone named Doug Engelbart, which was the point of view that computers could augment human creativity and communication. And I think a lot of you might have seen, if you haven't, look it up on YouTube, he did this thing called the mother of all demos, which is this incredible video where he demonstrates the mouse, word processing, hypertext, teleconferencing, the internet, like everything at once, just all invented, here in the peninsula. So what does that turn into today? Last year, I guess it was last year, we saw Watson, the first time that a computer beat humans in Jeopardy. And the thing about Watson is that did any of you watch that? Did some of you watch that game? So the sad thing about Watson is that he can beat the pants off of all these guys, but he doesn't even know he's standing next to people and that they're making fun of him, right? Like it's a very it's a weak view of intelligence, right? And then, of course, this is the kind of crystallization of this alternate view of the role of technology in human life is Steve Jobs, someone who's genuinely driven by a mission to expand humanity's capacity to create and communicate. So the question, of course, is, which one do you choose, the red pill or the blue pill, right? Which team are you on? Of course, we're driving full steam ahead with both. And mostly in the consumer side, we're driving massively fast with the Steve Jobs model. But I think on the military side and some of the other things going on in the world in data analytics, that other side's also driving full steam ahead. I don't know if they're at odds with each other or one will win or lose, but I wanted to bring up that point of view and obviously point towards replacing human intelligence with kind of knowledge processing is sort of single-minded and literal. But augmenting human intelligence has almost a kind of infinite ways of expressing itself, and I think that's what's so exciting about the App Store. I wanted to show, as my final slide, these two examples that really excite me, because these are two of the best-selling apps in the App Store besides games. Okay, one is on the left. They're both by TouchPress, who also worked on the Biophilia project. The one on the left is called The Element. It's made like $10 million in the App Store. Okay, who would have thought that one of the best-selling apps in the App Store was about, matter? It's about the elements of our universe and how they make things up. So, like I was saying before, the idea of a product has exploded, where you could have works of art, social media, etc. The other example is The Wasteland. Okay, again, best-selling app about T.S. Eliot poetry, but because it's done so beautifully and so well, it just sits up there, in the top 10 and keeps selling and selling and selling. And what's interesting, I think, about where we are in technology right now is that programs like Photoshop or Excel were inevitable in some sense. Like, these things would have happened. Somebody would have made them if these people hadn't. But a program like The Elements or The Wasteland or Biophilia or even Twitter and Instagram, they're not inevitable. And there's a guy named Jonathan Harris, who'd be an amazing speaker for this series, actually. He made this thing called We Feel Fine, a lot of very, very human social interfaces, sort of alternatives to Facebook. And what he's said is that these computers that we're putting on our bodies are rehearsals for when computers get connected to our minds, our brains. And that's going to happen quite likely, in the next 10 or 15 years. And what that really struck me, and I think that we're in a particular moment, especially now in these next 3 to 5 years, where we actually can very, very small changes in the App Store, for example, or things like the App Store, could have huge effects on the future of humanity and its relationship to computers, because you see how a tiny idea by a couple of people can explode and get 100 million users very quickly. So I think that's sort of how I want to close, is say, we actually have a choice. The future isn't inevitable, especially with the doors of distribution totally flung wide open by App Store, Amazon, eBay, things like that. So it's actually possible to choose futures where concentration is encouraged, where long-term engagement, like meaningful communication happen, and it's also possible to encourage a future of distraction, meaninglessness, triviality. And I just like to encourage people to sort of open your minds to the latter model, because each of us here could create a company or a product or just an idea that massively affects the future that we all live in 15 to 20 years from now. So that's my conclusion. I think there's maybe a tiny bit of time for questions. Couple minutes, yeah. Oh, over there.
This is a really inspiring talk, and you started out with how you're disappointed with the Macintosh having a desktop metaphor.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of the reasons why we have programs which use desktop metaphors is because we have tools which ask programmers to use a desktop metaphor.
Right.
And what Elements has done is, just cleared everything off screen and done their own thing, right? So if you had to encourage people to do something like this, what is the thing that you would change with tools?
Well, the thing is, it's already done. Like, watch. I mean, do you see what happens when you switch to another app? Like, you see what happens on. Oh, does it show that on there? Yeah. I mean, you see what happens on an iPad when you switch between things is it actually uses that language of cinema. So it already exists in iOS, and I think it will be adopted, by the other platforms. Where I think the biggest thing is using the whole screen. Like, it's just like television or movies. There's no point to be distracted by your email underneath a picture, underneath the alarm and so on. So I think getting rid of the windowing desktop interfaces is very, very positive for human attention. Like, people are designed to focus on one thing at once, and a messy desk is not the most stimulating or the most effective way for many people to work. So I think moving to these film-based interfaces is the answer in a nutshell. But we already have it. I mean, if you study iOS, especially on the iPad, I think they've done it really well. And wipes, dissolves, cuts. It's a language of cinema. Get a basic cinema book to learn some of that from another point of view. Yeah.
Sort of a vague question about, with respect to the music apps, the relationship between modes of aesthetic experience and gameplay. So gameplay can sometimes encourage sort of goal orientation, and I figured it out, I solved it, which is different than receiving a work of art and sort of how do you navigate that, or is that really a dichotomy?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about games is they are really addictive, but it's sort of the easy way out. Like, sometimes I say, interactivity in games is kind of like music and marches. Like, imagine that all music was marches, right? Like, we all like a march from time to time, but but there's way more to music than marches, and there's way more to interactivity than games. So it's just that it's easy if you give someone. It's like sugar. Or soap opera, like cliffhangers. Like, there's super stimuli for human beings that are easy ways to addict people, but the things we most enjoy in life aren't the addictive ones. Actually, addiction isn't pleasant at all, right? Like, when you finally get the thing you've been dying for all day, like a piece of cake or whatever, you're actually not feeling that good. What you're feeling is the absence of the pain of not having it, right? Like, it's very different than a sincere form of satisfaction. So, they often say, happiness is different than pleasure. And that's what I'd say, there's a way to make interfaces that make you happy instead of making you feel pleasure. Anything else? Yeah.
Do you do all your own sound and graphics?
No, there's tons of people. I mean, I have 30 person staff, and then collaborate with lots of people. The Bjork project alone was about 30 people. I didn't properly credit. There's a massive amount of people, and we produced the project, and we made several of the individual apps. But, yeah, tons of collaborators. Yeah.
Related to that, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the connection between the cost of making these sorts of experiences and the proliferation of them as a medium.
Yeah, so that's a huge issue and something I've been thinking about a lot in the last 2 years, because they are wildly expensive. But that presents an opportunity, and that's something I'm looking at with our companies is how could you make platforms that make this more of an easily adoptable and spreadable experience than something that costs like hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce. So it's just like any medium. Like, there's opportunities to disrupt it. Yeah.
The music apps that are in Biophilia, can you get them separately, like the Thunderbolts, or is that tied to your app?
No, they're all wrapped into the one big app.
Okay. Did she inspire the instrument interaction? Did she do any creation of the material with the apps, or?
Some. She's doing that now with some new stuff. Like the first part of the we did was, with Biophilia was more like she had a bunch of ideas, and we sort of turned them into interactivity and images. But she is doing that now more. We're making some new stuff, and she's using it to create songs that fall out of the interfaces. So it can go both ways. Anything else?
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.